This is a timeline I made. I made it in order to contextualize the different phases of Iranian art. You might notice that it's long and complex, and that's because the history of Iran is long and complex. But don't worry, I'm going to break it all down for you and explain what we are looking at here. This section on the top is the year count going back in time from right to left. And here we are at 2025. Each little gray line indicates 100 years, and each black line indicates 1,000 years. So to kind of help you contextualize the timescales we're dealing with here, notice that this little section gets us all the way back to 1000 AD, and this section gets us all the way back to Jesus. This section down here shows you what was going on in Iran during the dates marked out above. Now you may notice that we are going to be looking at cultural activity that spans back to 10,000 BC. Let me throw out a few more big markers to kind of orient us here. 500 years ago was Columbus. And as I already mentioned, 2,000 years ago we have Jesus. And every single cool thing that you love from classical Greece and Rome happened in this little section. Now you might notice that I capped off the classical age at 200 AD. And that is because I couldn't find a consensus amongst historians about when the sort of high point of classical antiquity transitions to what they call late antiquity. But after doing a deep dive into this topic, I think we can safely fix it to somewhere around 220 AD. And this really has nothing at all to do with Iranian art history, so I'll probably just have to make a whole separate video about this topic. But it seems to me that the drop-off in quality of Roman art really precedes the crisis of the 3rd century by about a decade or so. And I've gone ahead and indicated the shift from the sort of traditional Roman culture that we all think of to this more Byzantine style that starts to dominate around these last few centuries. This is a very controversial topic, and I don't want to pretend that my opinions are the sort of the most common opinions on it. However, I do think they're the correct opinions. If you want to see an entire video dedicated to this topic, then let me know in the comments below. And just for the purposes of the rest of this video, if you happen to notice that the classical age caps off at 200, it's because I'm using the older version of the timeline during the rest of the video, and I just haven't gone back and added this little purple section. I hope that doesn't bother you. Sorry, I'm rounding down from 220 to 200 AD. And while I think it's okay to round when you don't have really granular historical records, since we do have those granular historical records for this phase of the Roman Empire, then I might as well indicate those dates. And just for those uber nerds amongst you who believe that the word classical should not refer to anything Roman and should be limited just to that classical high point of Athenian culture, I've got you covered here. Okay, moving back another 2,000-ish years, we've got the pyramids of Giza. And another 1,000 years before that, we've got the first true writing with the proto-cuneiform script of Mesopotamia. Rewind another 2,000 years, and we've got the first city on planet Earth, the city of Eridu, which, not surprisingly, is also from Mesopotamia. If we go back 1,000 years before that, we see the intensification of agriculture, which goes along with a huge uptick in the production of ceramics. Jump back another 2,000 years before that, and we've got Gobëkli Tepe, one of the earliest archaeological sites ever discovered that shows monumental stone architecture. Rewind to 10,000 BC, and we've got the ancient settlement of Jericho. Now, Jericho was continuously inhabited for millennia, longer than almost any other civilization that has probably ever been documented. Now, when I say the word civilization, don't go thinking that Jericho was just one civilization during all that period. I mean, it's a site. It's an archaeological site. So it was probably occupied by a variety of different civilizations during its millennia-long history. And going back before 10,000 BC, we're into the Mesolithic period, which is basically like cavemen. And that's pretty much where my timeline stops. You could go back further if you want to. There's plenty of Neanderthal sites and whatnot that are documented in Iran, but that's not really kind of in the scope of what I want to look at. Interesting side note, since I got a picture of the woolly mammoth here, apparently woolly mammoths lived all the way up until around 8,000 BC. And of course, 8,000 BC is, of course, 10,000 years ago. And sometimes you'll see dates written this way as YA, years ago. And that tends to be when we're dealing with dates that are really deep back in time. Although it's more common to see it written as BP rather than YA, BP meaning before present. Now that's kind of funny if you think about it, because in like 100, 200, 300 years in the future, people who are reading these articles or these documents that use BP, it's like, well, wait, are they talking about present in their times or our times? And so when they started using BP, they decided to fix it at 1950. So present will forevermore be 1950, which is just silly and funny and extremely arbitrary. And as long as we're talking about arbitrary, we might as well mention the difference between BC and BCE and why I've chosen BC rather than BCE. So we all know that BC means before Christ. And the first year of our calendar starts with the year that Jesus was born. Now, some people think maybe he was born 4 years before that, but that doesn't really matter for the purposes of this discussion. We're just talking about where this point in time is fixed and why it's fixed there. Now, AD means Anno Domini, which is like the year of our Lord. And so I guess it's understandable why atheists and people who aren't Christian would not like to constantly be saying the year of our Lord, the year of our Lord, the year of our Lord, AD, 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 all the time. And so their solution is to paper over it with common. So everything before 1 AD is now BCE, before Common Era, and after 1 AD is, Common Era. And that's fine if you want to do it. You make your own timeline. You can put Common Era on it if you want to. For me, it just feels silly because, we all know what's really there behind the wallpaper that we've put up to cover over the actual historic event that the entire calendar is pinned to. So what about this section below Iran? These are 3 eastern regions that will be eventually subsumed into the Persian Empire or Persian sphere of influence. However, before the Persians arrive in Iran, these regions are kind of separate and have their own things going on. So basically, we're looking at Bactria Margiana, the Iranian interior, and northern India. Now, if you want to see what that looks like on a map, basically, this is what we're looking at. Bactria Margiana is up here and is pretty much overlapping with the modern countries of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. I guess maybe also a little bit of northern Afghanistan. What I'm calling the Iranian interior is this region, and for the purposes of this video, it's going to be both the inner part of Iran that was not directly controlled by the Elamites, as well as a significant portion of Afghanistan. And the other region that I'm going to be talking about is northern India, but of course today that comprises a significant portion of Pakistan. Now you can see in this map that all 3 of these regions will eventually come under the Achaemenid Persian Empire. However, before the Persians come onto the scene, we're going to be dealing with thousands of years of Elamite civilization. And as far as we know, the Elamites were pretty much just limited to this little sliver of southwestern Iran. That being said, there were definitely very interesting trade relationships between the Elamites, the Oxus civilization, the Helmand cultural area, and the Harappan civilization. And these trade relationships show up in artistic influence that we'll see in a wide variety of artifacts that we will examine. Okay, now there's a pretty important part of my timeline that I haven't yet discussed, and that is this section. This section I left as just sort of a place to show you some concurrent world events that may or may not be close in proximity to Iran. However, this section right here is very close in proximity to Iran. This is Mesopotamia. Let's zoom in, because these events shaped the Elamite and Persian civilizations in very important ways. Now, first off, I would just personally like to say that I consider Elam to be part of Mesopotamia. I mean, I know a lot of other people don't really place it as part of Mesopotamia because it's not literally between the two rivers, but like, look how close it is to everything that was going on in Sumer and Akkad. And that's why I color-coded Elam green and Mesopotamia blue, because these colors are very close to each other on the color wheel. And I wanted to indicate this, this cultural proximity. I've got a couple events from ancient Egypt, which are color-coded in yellow. And this orange line is the entire history of ancient Greece up until they were annexed by Rome. So you see Mycenaean Greece here, followed by the Greek Dark Age after the Late Bronze Age collapse, then Archaic Greece, Classical Greece, and the Hellenistic era. Now, it's kind of interesting, if you keep your eyes on that orange line that represents the total history of ancient Greece, and keep looking at it as we zoom out, you'll see it's kind of dwarfed by the combined Persian and Elamite civilizations. Now, that's not a really fair comparison because the Persian timeline goes all the way up to modern times, and of course, you could do the same with Greece. You could just extend Greece all the way up to modern times too, because obviously there are still Greek speakers in Greece today. On the other side of the Greek timeline, you could also add the Minoan civilization. And that would actually be an apt comparison between the relationship between the Persians and Elamites. Because in both of these cases, we have a case where a foreign people inherits a bunch of cultural forms that were pioneered by an ethnicity that they're not really directly related to. The Elamite language having no direct relationship whatsoever to the Persian language family, and the Greek language having no relation whatsoever to the Minoan language. But in both of these cases, we have the Persians adopting a lot of Elamite culture and the Greeks adopting a lot of Minoan culture. Finally, the last thing that we'd have to point out is that this timeline also includes a lot of Neolithic history of the Iranian region. And we could just include all that same kind of history in the Greek region, and it would probably look pretty similar on the map. Returning to ancient Greece, this is relevant to the history of Iran, because as everybody knows, Alexander the Great will bring about the end of the Achaemenid Persian Empire around 330 BC. And he will leave an indelible Greek stamp upon Persia for the next few hundred years. I've also marked out the Late Bronze Age collapse on this part of the timeline. The Late Bronze Age collapse is a favorite pet subject of mine, and I know a lot of other fans of ancient history are also really interested in this particular moment in history. And of course, the notoriety of the Late Bronze Age collapse owes a lot to the publication by Eric Klein called 1177, The Year Civilization Collapsed. And I would say that book is required reading for anyone who is interested in this period of history. Interestingly, it didn't seem to impact the Elamites too much, as far as I can tell. I've also included the other Bronze Age collapse. There was a great video that came out recently by a channel called Dig, called The Bronze Age Collapse No One Talks About. I'll link it in the description. Anyway, I'll have more to say about this interesting episode of history when we get closer to that in our series of videos. But I do think it is relevant to the history of Iran, since the Gutians are thought to have come from the Zagros Mountains, and they seem to have played a role in what happened there. Now, this part, which is like the last 2,000 years of our history, is mostly kind of unrelated events that I've sprinkled in to just try to orient you to the timeline, except for one very important event, or I should say an event that was very consequential in shaping the history and culture of Iran, and that is the life of this guy. Muhammad, of course, founded the religion of Islam, which is basically the reason why this line exists at this point, dividing the pre-Islamic Persian culture from the Islamic Persian culture. After Muhammad's death, the Arabs conquered Persia and ruled it for about 300 years. And by the end of this period, most Persians had converted to Islam, although a significant number of them did retain their native Zoroastrian faith. After that period, the Seljuk Turks took over a large part of Iran and ruled it for a while. Then the Mongols came in and ruled it for a while, followed by a group called the Timurids, who were kind of a mix of Turks and Mongols. By the way, the Persian section of my timeline shows periods of foreign rule along the bottom, while periods when native Iranians were in control is shown on the top. This gets tricky because there are a lot of periods, especially later on, when the Turkic tribes and Persian Iranian tribes mix a lot. But it gives you a basic idea. And just so you know, I didn't stick to that formula for the Elamite section of my timeline. So that, in the Elamite section, it just kind of shows the Elamites on top, and then on the bottom or in the middle, I've just got regions of what would later become Iran and kind of what was going on there. If I had wanted to show periods of foreign rule during the Elamite period, I definitely would have shown the Akkadian Empire taking over a large part of Elam. I know they took Susa. I can't remember if they took Anshan as well. We'll revisit that when we come up to this point. But I did show one period of foreign rule in Elam, and that is when the Neo-Assyrians conquered it. And I marked this out for two reasons. One, because it seems to have been a particularly kind of traumatic event for the Elamites, but also because there is some great artwork depicting the war between Elam and the Neo-Assyrians. And I'm going to want to show you guys that. Even though it is Assyrian art, not technically Elamite art, but because they've got Elamites depicted, I think it would be cool to take a look at it. One final thing I want to show you about the Elamite section of my timeline is this down here. Sometime between 2000 BC and 700 BC, historians and archaeologists aren't quite sure exactly when, but sometime in between that window of time, the Aryan tribes arrived in Iran and down into the other regions that we'll be discussing. A lot of archaeologists like to place this around 1500 BC. And it may well have been the case that various successive waves of Aryan tribes came down in, like I said, in successive waves. It might not have happened all at once from one people, but kind of groups of interrelated peoples that sort of came down in waves through this region. We don't really know, and that's why I've tried to indicate the uncertainty of this time and this place with this sort of alternating bands of color here. But anyway, these are the people who will become the Persians. Of course, it's way more complicated than that, but we'll get into that at a later point. The last two things I want to talk about before I end this video are periodization, how you slice and dice the timeline, and margin of error. Let's start with margin of error. There's a ton of information that I was pulling together for this single document, so for each piece of information, there's a chance that it got transferred over incorrectly. If you happen to catch anything that you know is inaccurate, incorrect, please reach out to me. Let me know. I can update it. Now, the second type of possible error is in cases where I had to interpret the data myself. Typically, in cases like that, I put a question mark so that you'll know that the data I was pulling from had some ambiguities in it. So one example of a site like that would be Tepe Yaha, which was a site in the interior of Iran that seems to have some very important links to Elamite civilization. And this is one of those sites that has a very long historical occupancy, but there's periods that the archaeologists have divided it into where they note some important change in the material culture. And each of these junctures is a point when a totally different culture might have come in and swept through and taken control, or, we have no idea. It was so long ago and there was no written record of what exactly happened. Anyway, a few of the periods within the Tepe Yaha chronology were not clearly articulated in the source material that I'm pulling from. For instance, you can see 4A and 4B here. And 4A is given as the late 3rd to early 2nd millennium BC, while 4B is given as the second half of the 3rd millennium BC. And so that means that when it comes time for me to fix them on the timeline, it's a little messy. Or rather, what I should say is that the reality is a little messier than it appears on the timeline. The timeline, because of the nature of it, it kind of just looks like it's more clear cut, when in reality, there's more ambiguity. And sometimes I did try to indicate that ambiguity by fading the section in or out, as you can see up here in Tepe Sofalin. Anyway, that brings us to the third type of possible error, which is just an error in the source material itself. Basically, you could draw a line like this right through the timeline, and everything on this side of the timeline should be more accurate, while everything on this side of the timeline will be less accurate. Can you guess why that is? It's basically because on the right side, we are dealing with historical societies, and on the left side, we're dealing with prehistoric societies. What makes a society prehistoric or historic is obviously just whether or not they have writing. So that didn't happen in all places at the same time. And then, of course, in addition to just having the technology of writing, you also have to have a culture that decides to put it to use for recording the historical data, which not all literate societies emphasize. Anyway, if you look at these dates, you'll notice that they end with odd numbers. They're not round numbers, they're not estimates, they're very precise numbers because this is well within the historical era. However, if you go all the way back to these dates, you'll notice that most of them do end in big round numbers, and that is because these are estimates. They're the best guesses of archaeologists based on the available evidence for the site. Now, technically, I should have written a little c for circa, around 550 BC, but you can imagine just adding this little c in front of like literally every date here would just kind of be redundant. So I'm counting on you to know that if we're looking at a big round number, this is probably an estimate and it should have the word circa in front of it. And again, you're going to find most of those dates on the left side of the timeline. Now, once in a while, you'll see a more specific date over here, like this one for the foundation of the Elamite city of Susa. However, we are still well before the historical period here, so this date must have been arrived at through radiocarbon dating. Now, typically, even with radiocarbon dating, there still is a margin of error, so I don't know how they got this very specific number for the foundation of Susa, but I will be looking more into it in detail for our next upcoming video, which will dive into Susa and Elam in general in a lot more detail. Okay, so now I want to talk about periodization. That is, how do historians slice and dice the timeline? So here's a historian on YouTube that I like. His name is Pre-Modernist. He's got a good channel. Go check him out. In his video called The History of Iran, a Primer, he talks about this issue of periodization. Now, he says that where you draw the lines is always arbitrary, and I actually want to quibble with that, even though I really like this guy and I like kind of like how he lays things out. I suppose what he means is that it's always somebody's choice where to draw the line, because in reality the flow of time is an uninterrupted process that, even if there are kind of interruptions politically, socially, culturally, the flow of time is still sort of this thing that flows. You can't slice it and dice it in the truest, realist sense. But if you are going to slice it and dice it and make up periods, then there are definitely better or worse places to draw that line. So if we just pause for a moment and see where he's chosen to draw that line, we can see that he's chosen to place the first line between Islamic Persia and what he's calling ancient Persia. And you may recall that I've also selected that as a pivotal moment on my own timeline. And the other line he's drawn is between Islamic Persia and what he's calling modern Persia. Now, you'll see on my own timeline, I have not differentiated these two periods, at least not with different color coding. However, I want to point out that I actually do agree with the pre-modernist in his decision to differentiate these two kind of eras. And the criteria that he puts forward is that what he's considering the modern era of Iran is the era of kind of Western interference or Western involvement, or maybe the word influence is the better thing here. And even the current government, you could argue, is, even though it's like kind of formed in opposition to the West, is still reacting to the West in some sense. By the way, I also like how he doesn't fix the modern era at like 1500, which is this really common thing you see a lot of times. Now, obviously, people who want to fix the modern era at 1500 are usually doing it in the context of like Western Europe. But anyway, I'm going to be sticking with kind of 1850 as the rough kind of beginning of the modern era for my timeline. Even though, again, I haven't really marked it out as a different color code on this section. And at the risk of getting totally sidetracked here, I'll just briefly sketch out why. Remember, I'm coming at this from the perspective of art history. And in art history, modern art typically starts in 1850 with the realism movement. And there's really only about a 10 to 20 year lag time between what's going on in the trendiest salons in Paris and what's starting to take shape in Iran. And that's not to say that like the Parisian trends, the art styles, like just swept through and like completely took over the popularization of Iranian culture, you know, immediately in the latter half of the 19th century. It took a while, but let's say like the elite artists, like the tippity top of the artists there, were paying attention to Western art, and in particular what was going on in Paris. So the main difference between the pre-modernists' timeline and my timeline is this part called Ancient Persia. You can see that he's not really showing you anything on this timeline before about 600 BC. However, he does include Elam in the video. He does talk about Elam. He just doesn't have it on his timeline. And you can see here that he gives the typical date of like 3200 BC as the beginning of Elamite civilization. Interesting side note here, the artwork he's chosen to act as an icon for Elamite civilization is actually a Babylonian artwork, not an Elamite artwork. Some of you may recognize this as the famous stele that depicts the Code of Hammurabi. However, I did say earlier that I believe that Elam should just be grouped in with Mesopotamia as basically just another Mesopotamian civilization. So I don't really have a big problem with the pre-modernist using this as an icon for Elamite civilization, because the art styles of Elam circa 1750 BC, which is around the time this was made, would have been virtually indistinguishable. Another interesting factoid, and probably the reason why the pre-modernist decided to use this as the icon for Elam, is that this was actually uncovered in Susa. And that's kind of an interesting story. Historians believe that it was taken several hundred years after its creation in Babylon, taken as plunder by raiding Elamite armies. Anyway, if we take this date of 3200 BC and apply it backwards in time, we see that it corresponds basically with the entrance of Elam into the historical period. So it's not necessarily the beginning of Elam so much as the beginning of the written records of Elamite civilization. So if I was going to divide up the timeline the way that he did, it would look more like this. I would include all of Elam's, written historical period in the ancient Iran part. But I have no problem with where he drew the lines for the medieval period or the modern period. And I can even understand why he didn't really include Elam on his timeline. It's because there were no Iranians in Iran before that period. Or at least they hadn't entered the historical record yet. But since my goal is to tell the story, the art history of the region that is today known as Iran, it doesn't really matter for me whether or not there were Iranians in Iran. I'm just telling the art history of the peoples of this region going back as far as we have interesting art to look at. And in my opinion, that period extends well into the prehistoric era. Now, prehistoric doesn't necessarily mean pre-civilization. We've got about 2,000 years between the beginnings of the first civilizations and the advent of the historical era. So rather than look at things in terms of like prehistoric versus historic, I'm going to be looking at this more in terms of pre-civilization versus the earliest civilizations. And I'm not really marking out the advent of writing here. I'm more looking just in terms of the lifeline of those earliest civilizations themselves. So after analyzing all the data on my timeline here, I decided to invent a term, the settling period. That's going to be a term that I'm using to describe this period of activity between kind of 7,500 BC and about 4,500 BC, when we see a lot of settling. People are settling down from a nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle and starting to have the first signs of agricultural kind of settled societies. However, rather than just do one video on each of these sections, I think I'm going to actually group them a little differently. So I think I'm going to try to do an entire video on the settling and first half of the Elamite period. Although that might be too ambitious, I might end up breaking that into 2 videos. But so far, let's say that that's one video, and then the next video is going to be on what I'm calling the Akkadian horizon. So much activity happened in this relatively short span of time that I feel like it's going to be a jam-packed video. We've got a lot to cover in that particular one, and a lot of great art too. And then I'm going to see if I can knock out the entire ancient Persia saga in one video. Again, I kind of think I won't be able to, but that's the goal. Now, once we get to the Islamic period, we've got so many historical records that if I wanted to, I could probably break this period up into like tons of videos. So I don't know how granular I really want to get for this period. I don't think I want to do 5 videos on it, but I also probably can't really do it justice if I only do 1 video or 2 videos on it. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. I guess I'd like to see if I could just do it in 2. So like everything before the Safavids and then the Safavids, maybe. Now, modern art and modern history are both incredibly boring and depressing topics to me, so I don't really know how much I want to get into the modern stuff. I reserve the right to get into it or not get into it, depending on how I feel once we get closer to this. Of course, how you guys feel about it does matter, so if you want me to make videos about the modern period, go ahead and leave those in comments as this series progresses, and if I get enough interest, I'll do it. All right, now, if you've stayed with me through this entire video, thank you so much for taking the time to spend all this time with my timeline. I literally took an entire summer to make it, so it's kind of crazy how much time I invested into it. I just got so interested in trying to see all these different archaeological sites, cities, civilizations in their context next to each other. And so I hope you will enjoy it, and I hope you will enjoy the videos that hopefully I will now proceed to make for each of these periods. Thanks a lot. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.